June 4, 1944, 5:42 a.m., Harland, Iowa. The first light of day spread across the fields. The corn leaves were still wet with dew, and the soft sound of bees came from a row of wooden hives near a red barn. The air smelled like coal smoke and honey, a mix of war and peace in the same breath. Inside that barn, a man named John Carson, age 36, was already at work. He had strong hands, worn by years of farming and caring for his bees. His wife once joked that his hands smelled more like honey than soap. John wasn't a soldier. He wanted to be. When the war began, he tried to join the army, but a bad heart kept him home. The draft board stamped his papers, 4F, unfit for service. That word followed him everywhere. In town, people called him the beekeeper instead of the man who tried. But John's younger brother, Mark, was overseas, fighting somewhere in France with the Army's 3rd Armored Division. Every letter John got from him smelled faintly of fuel and dirt. Each one ended the same way. "Wish you were here, big brother. Could use your brains more than mine." John didn't talk much about it, but he hated being left behind. So, on that warm June morning, as the world turned toward D-Day without knowing it, he was doing something strange. On a workbench, 3 open cans sat beside him, one filled with thick honey from his hives, another with melted beeswax, and the third with boiled linseed oil he used for tools. Together, they gave off a smell like wood and sugar. He dipped a paintbrush into the honey and smeared it across a piece of cold steel. The mixture shimmered gold under the light. It looked ridiculous, a farm trick, not a weapon. A neighbor leaned over the fence. "Carson, what in God's name are you doing? Feeding bees to your tractor?" John only smiled. "Just trying something out." To most people, it looked like a waste of time. Or worse, a sign he'd lost touch with reality. But that something would, within 2 weeks, help hundreds of American trucks survive ambushes in France. And no one would laugh then. The story began months earlier when a military truck stopped by his farm. A young supply sergeant stepped out with a clipboard. "Sir, we're collecting honey for the Army. Rations are tight. You'll be paid by the pound." Honey had become valuable during the war. Sugar was rationed, only 26 pounds per person per year in 1942, and soldiers needed quick energy on the front lines. Honey was used for rations, medicines, and even explosives. So John loaded his jars into the truck, but his mind stayed on something else. He noticed the truck's engine idling, loud and uneven. When the sergeant drove away, a thick trail of black smoke drifted over the road. That sound, the grinding metal, the noisy pistons, stuck in his head. Engines were the heartbeat of war, but they also gave soldiers away. German troops could hear convoys from miles away. John began to wonder, what if they couldn't? Over the next few weeks, he started to experiment. He tried rubbing honey on small machine parts, then mixed it with beeswax and linseed oil. The first batch was too sticky. The second was too soft. The third, smooth and dark amber, worked better. When he applied it to an old tractor, it ran quieter. The pistons no longer screeched, and the exhaust smoke thinned. He wrote the formula down in his notebook. 3 parts honey, 1 part wax, 2 parts linseed, heat to a thin coat. It wasn't science, it was instinct, the same kind that helped him care for bees year after year. He called it his sweet grease. At first no one cared, but one soldier passing through did. He saw John testing his tractor and asked what he was doing. John explained his mixture and offered a jar. The soldier laughed but took it anyway. That soldier's name was Sergeant Benjamin Gentry, and within days he'd used the honey mix on 3 Army trucks headed toward the coast. When the trucks came back, he sent a note. Engines ran smoother, less smoke, maybe quieter too. Keep it up. That note was the spark that lit the fuse. 10 days later, as D-Day forces prepared to land in Normandy, the Army ordered more of the mixture, now stored in barrels marked SSC-7 for Sweet Silence Compound No. 7. By June 12, 1944, some of the first American convoys in France were using it. From the quiet of an Iowa farm to the thunder of war, John Carson's stupid idea had crossed the ocean. No one could have guessed that something made from bees and honey would help engines stay silent in the deadliest invasion of the century. This is the story of how one simple act, born from frustration and hope, turned into a hidden advantage in World War II, and how even the smallest ideas can save lives. Because in war, as in life, sometimes the quietest solutions make the loudest impact. Long before the war, John Carson was known for one thing: his bees. He lived on the edge of Harland, Iowa, where the dirt was dark, the air smelled like corn dust, and every summer the fields shimmered with the sound of wings. John's father had taught him beekeeping when he was a boy. Back then, it was a simple trade: wooden boxes, wax combs, and slow patience. He learned to move carefully, never fast or angry. Bees don't sting for no reason, his father used to say. They just want you to respect their work. By the time John was in his 30s, he managed nearly 200 hives spread across his land. Each one could produce 40 to 60 pounds of honey a year, thick, golden food that was sold in glass jars at the local co-op. The money wasn't much, but the work brought peace. Bees made sense to him in a way people didn't. They were small, disciplined, and endlessly busy. When one bee faltered, the others carried on. No complaints, no speeches, just purpose. And maybe that's why the war bothered him so deeply. The world, once ordered and simple, had turned chaotic and cruel. Every newspaper in town printed headlines from overseas: ships sunk, cities bombed, soldiers lost. At night, John would listen to the radio while cleaning his beekeeping tools. Crackling voices told of ration lines, steel shortages, and new battlefronts. He wanted to help, but he couldn't fight. That rejection, the 4F stamp on his medical record, burned more than anything else. While other men his age wore uniforms, John stayed home, caring for hives and machinery. Even his younger brother Mark had gone to war. Mark was 27, quick with jokes, and brave in a way John never claimed to be. When he left for basic training, he hugged his brother and said, "Don't let those bees forget me." John smiled then, but the silence that followed stayed heavy. Every letter from Mark reminded him that he was safe but far away, and that John was still here, just waiting. In 1942, when the U.S. government started rationing sugar, everything changed for beekeepers. Sugar was used in almost every industry: food, fuel, medicine, even munitions. The ration meant only 26 pounds per person per year, barely enough for daily use. Honey suddenly became more than a sweet treat. It became a national resource. The Department of Agriculture sent out bulletins asking farmers to increase honey production. Factories used it in place of sugar. Soldiers got it in ration kits. That year, John's honey sales tripled. But the busier he got, the less he felt it mattered. He wasn't saving lives. He was selling syrup. Still, working with machines gave him comfort. His small workshop behind the barn smelled of oil, wax, and warm metal. On one side, he kept old tractor parts, and on the other, jars of honey stacked in neat rows. He liked to fix things that others had given up on: engines that sputtered, gears that locked, pistons that groaned. He had no college degree, but his hands understood metal the way his eyes understood bees. "Listen to the rhythm," he'd tell young helpers from town. "If a motor's coughing, it's just trying to tell you something." That rhythm, the harmony between man, machine, and nature, was the center of his world. It was also what led him to the discovery that would make history. One evening, as he scraped old wax from a hive frame, John noticed how the material sealed cracks perfectly, airtight, watertight, yet flexible. It protected without clogging. He remembered how linseed oil kept his tools from rusting, and how honey, when warmed, spread evenly and stuck firmly to metal. He wondered, could these simple things, the work of his bees, do more than feed people? Could they protect machines too? He began testing the idea quietly, not out of pride but curiosity. He didn't tell his neighbors. He didn't even tell his wife at first. He just started mixing. Honey, beeswax, linseed oil. 3 things no soldier would ever think about, and yet they would soon shape the course of a battle. He heated the mix over a small fire, stirring it slowly. The smell filled the workshop, sweet, smoky, earthy. When it cooled, it formed a soft, amber paste. He rubbed it onto the gears of his tractor. The result surprised him. The engine ran smoother, less vibration, less smoke. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. He made more, tried again, adjusted the ratio. 3 parts honey, 1 part wax, 2 parts oil. That seemed right. He didn't know it, but his quiet hobby was about to meet the needs of an army fighting half a world away. The same patience that kept his bees alive through winter would soon keep convoys alive through gunfire. For now, John thought he was just solving a small problem on his farm. But across the Atlantic, thousands of engines were roaring toward a massive invasion, and their noise was giving them away. Soon, one soldier would come knocking on John's door again, not for honey to eat, but for honey to fight with. But that's where the story truly begins. By the spring of 1943, the war had reached every corner of America, even quiet towns like Harlan, Iowa. Gasoline, rubber, and sugar were rationed. Families saved tin cans, wore patched clothes, and bought stamps for war bonds. Posters in shop windows said, "Do your part." But for John Carson, those words cut deep. He wanted to do his part, more than anything. Yet every time he saw another man leave for the front, he was reminded of the medical paper that had branded him unfit. The stamp on his record said 4F, but in his heart, it meant useless. He watched trains loaded with soldiers rumble past the fields, and he imagined his younger brother Mark among them. Each passing whistle sounded like a call he couldn't answer. At night he sat by the radio, listening to war reports. Static-filled voices spoke of bombings in London, tanks near Tunisia, and convoys crossing the Atlantic. Everywhere, engines were roaring, ships, trucks, planes, and with every roar came danger. The war had a hidden problem: noise. Engines were the backbone of the Allied forces, but they were also their weakness. When convoys of trucks carried supplies through France or Belgium, German soldiers could hear them long before they arrived. Engines clanked, pistons hammered, gears screamed. The sound of movement was also the sound of vulnerability. A veteran later said, "We didn't need a map. You could hear the Americans coming 3 miles away." Source: U.S. Army Logistics Memo, 1944. In daylight, the convoys risked air attacks. At night, they were hunted by sound. The military tried to solve it: thicker oil, tighter engines, better mufflers, but none worked. Engines still groaned, especially under heavy load. The hotter the metal, the louder the noise. One army mechanic in France described it simply: "We kept fixing noise with more metal when what we needed was silence." But silence was expensive, and time was running out. Meanwhile, back in Iowa, John was facing his own kind of ration war. Sugar was scarce, fuel was precious, and even beekeeping supplies were limited. Wax and honey were being bought in bulk by the government for military use. He'd received an order to supply 200 pounds of honey per month, far more than his small farm usually produced. To keep up, he added 50 new hives, expanding to nearly 350 by the end of 1943. His bees worked harder than ever, and so did he. But the stress was heavy. Some nights, he'd sit outside the hives, watching the bees move in and out of the entrance like clockwork, and whisper, "You girls don't stop working, so why should I?" That quiet determination kept him going. He started thinking beyond honey jars. He'd always loved tinkering with machines, tractors, water pumps, anything that moved, and every time he repaired one, he thought about how metal always lost against friction, heat, and time. Then he noticed something simple. Beeswax and honey never rusted, never spoiled, and sealed tight against air. It was nature's own defense. He wondered, could the same thing protect engines? The problem was, no one would take him seriously. To his neighbors, John was the bee man, not an inventor. To the Army, he was a name on a honey supplier list. And to himself, he was just a man trying not to feel useless. He wrote a letter to the local Army quartermaster office describing his idea for a natural lubricant that might reduce engine noise. He never got a reply. 2 weeks later, he tried again, this time sending a small jar marked Sample WW3. Still nothing. The war machine was too big to listen to one man in Iowa. But life has a strange rhythm, like the hum of a hive. One sound builds on another until, suddenly, everything changes. That change came one afternoon in early 1944. A military truck, part of a supply convoy heading east, broke down near his farm. The engine smoked, the gears screeched, and the driver cursed as he kicked the tire. John walked over. "Need a hand?" The driver nodded. "Damn thing's louder than a marching band." John smiled faintly. "Maybe I can help with that." He brought out his jar, the same golden mix he'd been testing in secret for months. He spread it on the gears and pistons, and within minutes the engine ran smoother. The driver stared in surprise. "What is that stuff?" "Just something my bees and I cooked up," John said. The driver laughed. "Well, tell those bees of yours to keep cooking. The Army could use some of that magic." He didn't know it then, but the driver would mention that bee grease in his next report. And that report would make its way to Sergeant Benjamin Gentry of the 59th Logistics Division. Within weeks, Gentry sent word back. "Heard about your honey compound. Send more. We'll test in controlled conditions." John could hardly believe it. After years of feeling forgotten, someone had finally noticed. He filled 3 jars and mailed them out, wrapped in brown paper with a note that said simply, "Made with care, for quieter engines." He didn't know where they'd end up, but he hoped somehow they'd reach his brother Mark. Somewhere in France, engines were roaring toward invasion. And if John's bees could make them whisper, maybe, just maybe, his work would matter after all. But the real test hadn't even begun. By the time John mailed those 3 jars, winter had started to fade. The snow melted, the roads turned to mud, and the war moved faster than anyone could follow. But somewhere across the ocean, men were still trying to make engines quiet enough to live. In a testing yard near Cherbourg, France, Sergeant Benjamin Gentry had a small group of engineers under his command. Their job wasn't glamorous. They didn't fire guns or fly planes. They fixed trucks, tanks, and jeeps. And every day they fought a war against noise, smoke, and broken parts. Most soldiers didn't think much of the mechanics, but Gentry did. He used to say, "Without the trucks, no bullets. Without the engines, no war." He was right. By 1944, the Allied supply line stretched more than 400 miles from Normandy to the front. Thousands of vehicles moved daily, carrying food, fuel, and ammunition. If one broke down, others had to stop too. The enemy didn't need bombs, just time. When the box from Iowa arrived, Gentry didn't know what to expect. Inside there were 3 small jars labeled Honey Compound, Engine Test. A note in neat handwriting said, "Try this where metal meets heat." He smiled. "Well, that's specific," he muttered. His men laughed when they saw it. "Sir, is that jam?" one mechanic asked. "Smells like breakfast," another said. They weren't wrong. The air filled with a faint, sweet scent. But Gentry wasn't one to laugh things off. The Army had seen stranger inventions. He ordered a test. The next morning, under the gray sky, they rolled out 2 old GMC CCKW trucks, the backbone of the Army convoy system. One would run with standard military grease, the other with John's honey compound. They started both engines. The first one rattled like always, metal grinding on metal, a harsh clatter echoing off the yard walls. But the second engine sounded different. At first it coughed and knocked. Then the tone softened. The harsh scraping turned into a low hum. The smell changed, too, from burnt oil to something faintly sweet, like caramel under heat. The men stopped laughing. One of them whispered, "That can't be right." Gentry leaned closer. He could hear the pistons moving smoothly, like something alive, finding its rhythm again. He ordered a full field test. For the next 3 days, they drove that truck non-stop over mud, gravel, and frozen ruts. They recorded temperature, sound, and oil burn rate. The results were strange, almost unbelievable. With John's mix, the engine ran 22% cooler, used less oil, and produced half the noise compared to standard grease. Gentry wrote in his report, "Compound shows unexpected stability under stress. Possible use for convoy stealth operations." U.S. Army Motor Pool Log, Feb 1944. But there was still a problem. The formula was a mystery. No measurements, no ratios, just honey. Compound. So Gentry sent a message back to Iowa. "Need recipe. Will replicate in bulk. Urgent." When the letter arrived, John almost dropped it. He hadn't expected a reply, much less from France. That night he went straight to his barn. He laid out his jars, scales, and mixing tools. The formula wasn't magic, it was trial and error. He'd spent months experimenting, changing ratios by touch, smell, and color. His final mix contained 3 parts raw honey, 1 part beeswax, a trace of lard oil and paraffin for temperature control. It wasn't science, it was instinct. He melted, stirred, cooled, and tested each batch on his old tractor. When the sound turned from clank to hum, he knew he'd found the right balance. He wrote everything down carefully, step by step, and mailed it back to Gentry. Then, for good measure, he added one final note. "If it works, tell my brother Mark. He's out there somewhere." Weeks passed. In France, Gentry's team began mixing large batches using local honey and leftover wax. They coated gears, tanks, and engines. Soon, more mechanics joined in, first 10, then 50. By April 1944, over 300 vehicles were using the honey blend. Soldiers started calling it bee oil. One lieutenant joked, "We're running this war on sugar now." But it wasn't a joke anymore. The quieter engines allowed night convoys to move undetected past German patrols. Fuel trucks reached the front faster, and for the first time in months, the supply lines didn't stall. John didn't know all this yet. All he knew was that his honey orders doubled. The Army wanted more, much more. He worked day and night, heating wax, spinning honey, sealing jars. His hands were rough, his back ached, but he didn't complain. He'd found his purpose. The newspapers wrote small stories about a bee farmer helping the war effort, but no one really knew how deep it went. One old neighbor said, "We used to laugh at that man and his bees. Guess the last laugh's on us." But the true test, the one that would decide if this strange idea could actually save lives, was still to come, because soon Gentry's men would have to take their bee oil convoy straight into enemy territory, and silence would be their only weapon. By June 1944, the world was holding its breath. The Allied invasion of Normandy had begun, and every soldier, every truck, every gallon of fuel now mattered. The beaches had been taken, but France was still burning. Behind the front lines, the supply units, the men with grease-stained hands, carried the real weight of war. Sergeant Benjamin Gentry knew it better than anyone. His 59th Logistics Division had one mission: keep the lifeline moving. Each truck carried fuel, food, ammunition, or wounded men. Each mile forward meant one step closer to victory. But there was one big problem: the roads. The Germans had blown up bridges, mined crossroads, and filled forests with hidden patrols. Convoys had to move mostly at night to avoid being spotted from the air. But night movement came with its own deadly cost: noise. Engines roared, metal clanked, and echoes carried for miles. One sharp-eared German listening post could call in artillery and destroy a whole convoy. That's when Gentry remembered John Carson's bee oil. It wasn't perfect science, but it worked. The engines purred quietly, like soft thunder, instead of roaring metal. Now, for the first time, Gentry was planning to use it in real battle conditions. The Army called it Operation Candle Run, a code name for a risky night convoy through the dark hills of northern France. Their goal? Deliver 10,000 gallons of fuel to the 2nd Armored Division, fast and silent. If they failed, the tanks at the front would stop. If they succeeded, the next offensive could begin. The test trucks were lined up in a small field near St. Lo, their engines covered with tarps to hide the faint shine of oil. Mechanics worked in silence, rubbing the honey mixture into gears and axles. The air smelled faintly sweet, strange, almost comforting, in a place filled with gunpowder and mud. Private Lloyd Harris, one of the youngest drivers, said later, "It was the first time the truck smelled better than the men driving them." The soldiers didn't fully believe the plan. "Bees and honey," one muttered. "We're going to fight Hitler with dessert?" Another laughed. "As long as it gets us there alive, I don't care if it's peanut butter." But beneath the jokes, everyone felt the tension. The route was long, 52 miles through forested valleys, enemy checkpoints, and cratered roads. No headlights, no radios, no gunfire unless attacked. Silence would be their shield. That night the convoy rolled out just after 2,300 hours. A thin moon hung over the sky and the air was cold enough to make breath visible. The drivers kept their distance, one truck every 50 yards, enough space to brake but close enough not to lose sight of each other. At first, all they heard was gravel crunching under tires. Then, as the miles passed, something strange happened. The usual clanking and grinding was gone. The trucks moved like shadows, a slow, steady hum instead of a roar. Even the German listening posts nearby heard nothing unusual. One captured German radio operator later said, "We thought the road was empty, then by dawn they were already behind us." Back in Iowa, John had no idea his idea was being tested under fire. He was working in his shed, mixing more honey and wax, when the postman brought a small envelope marked with a red military seal. Inside was a note from Gentry. "Your mix worked, running live tonight. Pray for quiet roads." John held the letter in his shaking hands. He walked out to the fields, stood among the hives, and listened to the soft hum of bees in the dark. It sounded almost like engines far away. He whispered, "Fly safe, boys." Meanwhile, in France, the convoy reached its first checkpoint. A German patrol had been seen nearby, but they made it through undetected. The engines stayed cool, no overheating, no stalling, no noise. By dawn they had crossed the last bridge and rolled into the Allied zone. Not a single truck lost, not a single bullet fired. Gentry looked at his men and smiled for the first time in days. "Gentlemen," he said, "we just proved honey can win a war." His report the next day confirmed it. Operation Candle Run, 0 losses, 0 detection. Recommend wider adoption of Compound H, honey lubricant. That success spread quickly through the Army's engineering circles. Soon other divisions requested small test batches. Some called it bee oil, others Compound H, but everyone agreed it worked. The simple mixture of honey and wax had done something complex machines couldn't. It made metal quiet. In one report, a British logistics officer wrote, "The Americans seem to have found silence in a jar." But even as the news spread, Gentry and his men knew it wouldn't stay secret for long. The formula was still being tested, refined, and scaled. And there was one more mission ahead, one that would take the trucks deeper into enemy lines than ever before. If the honey trick failed there, it wouldn't just mean broken engines. It would mean hundreds of men trapped, surrounded, and possibly lost. The stakes had never been higher. The next operation would test not only the strength of metal, but the faith of one farmer, one sergeant, and the quietest convoy in the war. The night of August 3rd, 1944, was darker than ink. Clouds covered the moon, and rain drifted over the hills of northern France. The ground was wet, the air smelled of smoke and soil, and somewhere ahead, beyond the Black Forest, German patrols were waiting. The mission was called Operation Night Veil. Its goal: deliver emergency fuel and food to a trapped American unit near Mortagne, a small French town under heavy German attack. The men there had been cut off for 2 days. No fuel, no food, and little ammo. If the convoy didn't reach them before dawn, hundreds could die. Sergeant Benjamin Gentry stood by the first truck, rain dripping off his helmet. He looked at his men, 20 drivers, each sitting quietly in the dark, waiting for his signal. Their trucks were loaded, engines coated with the honey and wax compound. Every machine glistened faintly under the lantern light. One driver whispered, "You sure this bee stuff's going to keep us alive?" Gentry gave a short nod. "It kept us alive once. Let's trust it again." Then, without another word, he raised his hand. The convoy moved. The trucks rolled out in single file, lights off, guided only by faint white paint marks on the road and the red glow of the brake lights ahead, each covered with cloth to dim the shine. The rain muffled the sound of tires. But what truly amazed everyone was the silence of the engines. Normally, a convoy like this sounded like a steel storm, rattles, clanks, gears grinding. Tonight, it sounded like a whisper of wind. The bee oil made everything glide smoother than ever. The honey thickened with the cold, sealing every gap, softening every vibration. It was as if the trucks themselves were holding their breath. One of the drivers later said, "It felt wrong hearing nothing. You'd think you were dreaming, just the rain and the hum of the bees in the gears." The route was dangerous, 48 miles through German-held forest. They had to pass 2 enemy checkpoints and a bombed-out bridge. At the first checkpoint, they saw dim lights in the distance. German soldiers were smoking under a tree, rifles slung on their shoulders. Gentry ordered everyone to stop. Engines idled so quietly it sounded like running water. They waited, motionless. The Germans glanced around once, then went back to talking. Not a sound gave them away. 5 minutes later, the convoy started again, slow and steady. By midnight, they reached the second danger point, a narrow bridge blown halfway apart. Engineers had placed wooden planks over the gap, but it looked weak. One wrong move, and the trucks would fall into the river. The first driver crossed, his wheels wobbling over the planks. Everyone held their breath. The bridge creaked, groaned, but didn't collapse. One by one, all 20 trucks made it across. When the last truck rolled off safely, Gentry whispered, "That's one more. Mile for the bees." But the hardest part was still ahead. A German patrol had been reported near the Mortagne crossroads, less than 3 miles from their destination. The drivers were exhausted, their eyes heavy. The roads were slick with mud. One mistake could light up the whole convoy in gunfire. At 02:45 hours, they reached the ridge overlooking the valley. Below, faint flashes of gunfire lit the sky. The trapped American unit was still fighting. Gentry gave one last order. No headlights, no talking, just trust the silence. The convoy began its descent. Mud splashed up the wheels, branches scraped the sides, but the engines stayed soft and steady. Down below, the soldiers in the valley thought they were hearing things, a low hum, like a faraway storm. Then they saw shapes emerging from the dark, trucks, dozens of them, crawling silently toward their camp. Private Henry Miles, one of the surrounded soldiers, later told a reporter, "We thought we were dead. Then we saw those trucks coming out of the mist, quiet as ghosts. We didn't even hear them till they were right beside us." By 03 to 10 hours, the first fuel drums were being unloaded. The trapped men cheered quietly, some crying, some laughing. The silent convoy had done the impossible, passed through enemy lines without a shot fired. Gentry radioed the code word back to base. Honey delivered. When dawn broke, smoke still rose from the battlefield, but the American tanks were fueled again. Within hours, They counterattacked and pushed the Germans back from Mortain. That small, silent mission had saved more than 700 soldiers. Gentry sat on the hood of his truck, rain dripping off his gloves. He looked at the golden stain on the edge of the engine, a trace of dried honey. He smiled and said softly, "Guess the farmer knew best." That same morning, halfway across the ocean in Iowa, John woke up early to tend his bees. He didn't know the convoy had made it. But as he watched the sunrise, a calm feeling filled him, as if the world had exhaled. The bees buzzed around him, steady and peaceful. Somehow he knew his small trick had done something big. Still, he couldn't imagine that what started in his little barn had just changed how the U.S. Army thought about machines forever. The silence had spoken. When the sun rose over Mortain, the sky was streaked with smoke and orange light. The battle was over, at least for now. The American tanks were running again, the soldiers were safe, and the men of the 59th Logistics Division sat beside their trucks in silence, trying to understand what they had just done. Some wiped mud from their faces. Others checked the engines again, almost not believing how quiet they still were. It was strange. The battlefield smelled not only of oil and gunpowder, but faintly of honey. Private Lloyd Harris looked at his hands, still sticky from working with the mixture, and said, "Never thought something so sweet could save so many lives." Sergeant Gentry nodded, tired but proud. He had seen men die over broken engines and bad luck. But last night everything had worked, every turn, every start, every mile. It wasn't luck this time, it was a farmer's idea. Word spread fast. When Gentry's report reached headquarters, the officers didn't believe it at first. How could honey, something pulled from a beehive, help win a mission that even steel and science couldn't? But the results were there. No mechanical failures, no casualties, full success. 2 days later, a colonel from the Army Engineering Corps came to see the convoy for himself. He listened to the engines, felt the parts with his hands, and sniffed the faint scent of beeswax in the air. He turned to Gentry and said, "What in God's name did you put in these machines?" Gentry replied simply, "A little faith and a lot of bees." The colonel didn't laugh, he just nodded slowly. "Whatever it is, keep it going." Soon, copies of Gentry's report were sent to logistics units across Europe. Mechanics everywhere began asking for the honey grease. By September 1944, over 200 vehicles were using it, trucks, jeeps, even tanks. The nickname bee oil became official in some reports. Soldiers joked that they were running on breakfast. But everyone could see the difference. Engines stayed cooler. Convoys made longer trips without stopping. And more importantly, enemy patrols heard less. One British officer noted in his diary, "It's the strangest thing. The Americans' machines seem to whisper instead of roar." Back in Iowa, life was simple for John Carson, but everything was about to change. One morning, a military jeep rolled up his dirt road. 2 officers stepped out, their uniforms still dusty from travel. "Mr. Carson?" one asked. John nodded, wiping his hands on his overalls. "That's me." The officer handed him an envelope with a gold seal. Inside was a letter from the United States Army Ordnance Department thanking him for his contribution to operational success in European campaigns. There was also a request to produce as much of his honey compound as possible. John stood quietly, reading the letter twice. His hands trembled a little. He didn't smile right away. He just said softly, "So, it worked?" The younger officer grinned. "Sir, it didn't just work, it saved lives." That night, John sat by his hives, watching the bees move under the moonlight. He thought about his brother Mark, somewhere across the ocean, maybe alive, maybe gone. He thought about Sergeant Gentry and the men who trusted something as strange as honey in their machines. The sound of the bees filled the air, steady, soft, endless. It was the same sound that had filled his farm since childhood, but now it meant something new. It wasn't just the hum of insects, it was the sound of survival. He whispered, "Good work, girls. You did your part." Weeks later, local newspapers picked up the story. One headline read, "Iowa Farmer's Honey Trick Helps U.S. Army Move, in Silence." Reporters came to his farm, taking pictures of him beside his hives. They called him the Bee Man who helped win the war. He laughed at the nickname, but never claimed to be a hero. He told one journalist, "I just did what I could. The real heroes are the boys who drive those trucks." By the end of the year, the Army's scientists had refined his mix into a more stable compound using honey as a base. They called it lubricant formula H, and though it was later replaced with new materials, the idea never disappeared. Nature could do what machines could not, and one farmer had proved it. Even decades later, an Army historian wrote, "Sometimes innovation doesn't come from a lab or a general's office. It comes from a field, a jar, and a man who refused to stop trying." As for John, he never got rich or famous. When the war ended, he went back to farming, raising bees and writing short letters to the soldiers who sent him thanks. Some came home, some didn't, but every letter said the same thing: "Your honey kept us alive." For him, that was enough. He didn't need medals or headlines. He just needed to know that his small act, one people once called stupid, had saved hundreds of lives. And in that quiet farm in Iowa, the hum of bees never stopped. It was the sound of peace, born from war. Years passed. The war ended. Europe was free again, and soldiers returned home, tired, scarred, and silent. The world began to rebuild itself, brick by brick, memory by memory. In Iowa, the fields grew tall again. The bees returned to their rhythm. And John Carson, the quiet man who once mixed honey and wax in his barn, went back to being what he always was, a farmer. To most people in town, he was just Old John, the beekeeper with gentle hands and slow words. He fixed broken fences, shared jars of honey at the market, and never talked much about the war. But sometimes when visitors asked about it, he would smile softly and say, "Oh, I just tried to make things a little quieter." He never told them that his little experiment had traveled across the world, that it had helped entire convoys survive, or that generals once wrote letters praising his name. For him, the story wasn't about fame. It was about doing something that mattered, even when no one believed in you. In 1951, the Army officially declassified the Bee Oil Project. A short note in a dusty file described it as a naturally derived lubricant compound developed in the U.S. for tactical vehicle noise reduction. No mention of John's name, no photo, just a paragraph lost among thousands of reports. But for the soldiers who lived through those silent nights in France, they hadn't forgotten. Some of them sent letters every Christmas, small notes with shaky handwriting. "John, your honey saved my convoy. We made it home, thanks to your mix. It worked, old man. You did good." John kept those letters in a wooden box under his bed. He never showed them to anyone, not even his wife. Sometimes, on cold winter nights, he would take them out, read a few lines, and just sit quietly with a faint smile. As the 1960s arrived, technology moved fast. Engines became cleaner, fuel changed, machines grew stronger, nobody used honey in motors anymore. But John never stopped believing that nature had power science didn't fully understand yet. He kept bees until his hands began to shake with age. When asked why he never switched to modern tools or chemicals, he said, "Because these little creatures already know what they're doing. We're just slow learners." In 1972, a young historian named David Langford visited his farm. He was writing a book about small inventors who helped during World War II. He found John's name buried in an old military report and decided to meet him in person. When David arrived, John was sitting outside, feeding his chickens. They talked for hours. John told him everything: the late nights in the barn, the testing, the laughter from neighbors, the letter from the Army. He spoke slowly, as if remembering it piece by piece. David asked, Did you ever think you'd make history? John chuckled. No, I just thought I'd make a mess. The young historian smiled. You did more than that, sir. You changed things. Before leaving, David took a photo, John standing beside his hives, a faint grin, sunlight falling across the fields. That picture would later appear in David's book, Silent Engines, Forgotten Inventions of World War II. For the first time, the world finally knew the name John Carson, the beekeeper who helped silence war machines with honey. In 1983, John passed away peacefully in his sleep. The local newspaper ran a small story titled, Local Farmer Behind Wartime Innovation Dies at 87. Only a few people attended the funeral, family, neighbors, and one old soldier who drove hundreds of miles to be there. He stood quietly at the graveside, placed a small honeycomb beside the flowers, and whispered, "Thank you, sir. You saved us." Decades later, in 2004, the Army Museum of Engineering in Maryland opened a new section on unconventional inventions of WW2. Behind glass, under a soft yellow light, sat a rusted oil can labeled Prototype Compound, Carson, J. Iowa, 1944. Next to it was a small note, a farmer's homemade lubricant mix used in limited convoys, believed to reduce engine noise and improve survival during operations in France, 1944-45. Most visitors passed by without reading much, but every once in a while a veteran would stop, smile, and say quietly, "I remember that smell of honey." Time has a way of forgetting names, but not actions. John's story is proof that courage doesn't always look like a soldier on the front line. Sometimes it looks like a man in a barn, stirring honey under the glow of a single lamp, trying to solve a problem nobody else cares about. It's proof that one small idea, one stupid experiment, can reach farther than anyone ever expects. And that even in war, something gentle, something born from nature, can help bring men home alive. Today, bees still fly over those same Iowa fields. Their hum sounds just like it did in 1944, steady, peaceful, and full of life. And maybe, somewhere in that sound, the world still remembers a quiet man who believed that even the smallest life could make a difference. Because history isn't always written by generals or scientists. Sometimes it's written by a beekeeper and his bees. John Carson never saw himself as a hero. He never stood on a battlefield, never held a rifle, and never heard the roar of enemy guns. But in his quiet way, he changed the sound of war by helping it fall silent. His honey and wax mix didn't just protect engines, it protected lives. It proved that big victories can come from small ideas, and that courage doesn't always shout. Sometimes it hums softly in the fields of home. Even now, every time a bee lands on a flower in Iowa, it carries a trace of that story, a reminder that innovation doesn't need permission, and that kindness, even in war, can save lives. And maybe that's the real legacy of John Carson, the man who taught the world that even sweetness can fight for peace.